The end of the world is right around the corner, and these are the countries most likely to cause it. China, India. High up along the Himalayan border between China and India are scores of troops armed with medieval clubs, slingshots, and even spears. This isn't an instance of two opposing armies being teleported through time to the present day. This is how World War III starts. The Sino-India border dispute has been raging for decades, and little if any progress has been made to resolve it. The dispute concerns multiple pieces of territory along the Himalayan border between India and China, which are claimed by both sides. Aksai Chin is currently administered by China as part of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and Tibet Autonomous Region, but is claimed by India as part of the territory of Ladakh, which itself is also disputed with Pakistan, technically making this region a three-way dispute. The territory is largely a wasteland, but does have some good pasture land along the edges of its boundaries, making it somewhat valuable for food production. The second disputed territory is Arunachal Pradesh, and it's the result of the McMahon Line, an agreement signed between British India and Tibet. However, as China believes it owns Tibet, it says the agreement was invalid as Tibet was never independent and legally had no right to sign said agreement. In 1962, with relations deteriorating between India and China, the Sino-Indian War broke out along the disputed territories. Before the war, there had already been a series of violent border skirmishes, and India's support for the 1959 Tibetan uprising, including granting asylum to the Dalai Lama, angered Mao and set the precedent for war. When India rejected Chinese settlements throughout 1960 and 1962, the war was inevitable. The perfect cover came with the Cuban Missile Crisis, during which the Soviet Union and United States were far too concerned with each other to pay much attention to a border dispute between India and China. China launched an invasion of Ladakh and across the McMahon Line, successfully pushing back Indian forces. The war ended with a ceasefire declared by China, after which it pulled its forces back to its own line of actual control. India was forced to give up border outposts it had built, and was humiliated in its defeat. Border skirmishes would continue over the years, until finally both sides agreed that in order to limit the possibility of war, their troops would be forbidden from using their rifles, machine guns, or explosives. This led to a very peculiar condition along the disputed border, with both sides arming their soldiers with weapons more reminiscent of the medieval ages than a modern military. Chinese soldiers have been equipped with bats covered in barbed wire and similar implements, while Indian troops often use iron police batons. However, there's plenty of improvisation amongst both sides' forces, and rock throwing is very popular for both sides. The skirmishes are so frequent that one source reported that the world is only aware of 1 to 2% of the brawls that break out with regularity amongst the border. In June of 2020, however, things heated up, as yet another massive brawl broke out, which saw casualties on both sides. India admitted to about 20 deaths, while China only admitted to 4, though it's certain there were more than that. The outbreak caused both sides' militaries to shift into high alert, and had a surprising effect on the Indian military. For decades, India's military has languished from a lack of true modernity brought about by its refusal to pick sides between the Soviet Union and the US, with the end result being that the only military equipment they procured in large numbers was bottom-shelf Soviet stuff. Today, this leaves the Indian military woefully lacking versus China, and prompted India to rethink its relationship with the West, specifically America, in hopes of securing more modern arms, the goal of which is simple: defeat China in a new war. India's refusal to join global sanctions against Russia, and instead enrich itself with cheap Russian oil, threaten its new relationship with the US, though, and access to state-of-the-art American weapons. Tensions have always been high between the two nuclear powers, but China added fuel to the fire by developing close ties with Pakistan, India's mortal enemy. Now China is attempting to pressure India by intimidating the Indian military along the disputed border and punish it for seeking to draw closer to the US. If another major brawl breaks out between the two sides, an escalation to full-blown war is very possible, and that could quickly lead to a third world war with devastating consequences. Neither side's military is powerful enough to completely destroy or even neutralize the others, and the terrain only makes for prosecuting a war between the two even more difficult. However, the real danger comes from the fact that India sits on China's trade jugular, as many of China's most important trade routes pass through the Indian Ocean. Despite now having the largest navy in the world, China doesn't have the capabilities to fight far from its own shores, which means it would be unable to stop an Indian blockade of its trade. The Chinese military is a degree of magnitude more capable than India's, but lacks the ability to strike any significant blows across the daunting Himalayan peaks. As China slowly begins to starve economically and India plays a strong defense, China's only remaining option might be the use of nuclear weapons, with India retaliating in kind. This would spell the end of the world for all of us, as even a limited exchange would disrupt the environment enough to be catastrophic everywhere. But that's not the only way India could be involved in bringing about the end of the world. India-Pakistan. China isn't the only nation that India has a bad relationship with. Situated on its western border, Pakistan has been a thorn in India's side ever since the two nations gained their independence. The prevalent cause? The disputed region of Kashmir, which sits between the two states. In 1947, the two nations went to war for the first time. Newly independent, Pakistan feared that the Maharaja ruling over Kashmir and Jammu would turn to India after princely states were allowed to pledge allegiance to either Pakistan or India, or remain independent. Pakistan supported tribal Islamic forces which attacked and occupied parts of the disputed territory, forcing the Maharaja to sign the instrument of accession to the Dominion of India in order to receive Indian military aid. On January 1, 1949, a ceasefire was declared, with a line of control established and India in control of 2/3 of Kashmir and Pakistan in control of 1/3. In 1965, war broke out again after Pakistan infiltrated forces into Jammu and Kashmir in order to launch an insurgency against the Indians. In retaliation, India launched a full-scale military attack on West Pakistan, sparking a massive war that lasted almost 3 weeks. The engagement resulted in the largest tank battle since World War II, with India roundly defeating Pakistani forces. A diplomatic effort led by the US and Soviet Union led to a ceasefire and the pullout of Indian forces, giving Pakistan badly needed breathing room. In 1971, East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, declared independence from Pakistan. Pakistan responded with the largest genocide since World War II, killing up to 3 million natives and committing horrible atrocities on surviving civilians. India sent troops to intervene, and Pakistan retaliated with a full-scale air attack against India, prompting the Third Indo-Pakistani War. Despite having the initial upper hand, Pakistan was once more defeated by India, and Bangladesh was liberated, with territory taken by India in West Pakistan returned the next year as a gesture of goodwill. Pakistani forces performed so terribly that it led to the largest number of POWs since World War II, with over 90,000 Pakistani soldiers surrendering to the Indians. In 1999, the two nations fought their latest official war, though it was far more limited in scope than before. In early 1999, Pakistani troops infiltrated past the line of control and occupied Indian territory in the Kargil district. India launched a massive armed response and used global diplomatic pressure to force Pakistan to remove their troops. After 2 months of fighting, India had retaken most of the territory, but larger-scale fighting was feared. This led the international community, led by the US, to threaten to isolate Pakistan's already fragile economy. In the end, Pakistan lost yet again, as admitted by Nawaz Sharif, one of Pakistan's prime ministers, and lost an estimated 4,000 troops in the fighting. No war has broken out since between the two powers, but with Pakistan on a decades-long losing streak against the superior Indian military, the nation has instead resorted to terrorism to try to undermine its stronger neighbor. In 2001, there was a terrorist attack against the Indian parliament by two Pakistani-trained terror organizations, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. This was followed by the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks, where 12 bombings and mass shootings were carried out by Pakistan-backed terrorists. Since then, India has taken a more proactive stance on targeting Pakistani terrorists and even launched attacks inside of Pakistani territory to eliminate terrorist training camps and targets of opportunity. Pakistan has for its part denied any support for terror organizations, but it's well known by the intelligence community that Pakistan's ISI has for decades helped arm, train, and even provide shelter and medical treatment for terror groups that target both Americans and Indians in the region. When Osama bin Laden was discovered to be hiding out in a Pakistani town known for housing the Pakistani military's top leadership, Pakistan feigned ignorance, but the world was hardly surprised. Since then, border skirmishes have intensified, as have Pakistani-backed terror attacks against Indian targets. Pakistan knows that it's inferior to India, and thus, in case of a new war, it's likely to rely on smaller tactical nuclear weapons to hold off India's forces. To counter the threat, India has developed a deep strike doctrine designed to pierce into the heart of the nation and force Pakistan to make a terrible choice: deploy nuclear weapons on its own soil or accept military defeat. Any use of Pakistani nuclear weapons, however, will be immediately met by India's own nuclear weapons, prompting an exchange that could leave hundreds of millions dead in the first few weeks alone. China, however, is also likely to use the situation to its advantage, given its close ties to Pakistan, and launch its own offensive against India over the Himalayas to at least secure disputed territory along India's northern border. With other major world powers throwing their weight behind one or the other, an India-Pakistan war is more likely than ever to spark World War III. But as we move up this list, we start getting into scenarios so plausible, you should probably make some real preparations for a disastrous global war. China, USA. On paper, the United States and China have very little incentive to actually go to war against each other. In reality, a Sino-American war is so likely that the Pentagon considers it a near 100% probability within the next 20 years, and you better believe they're prepping for it. China is a rising power, and it's the nature of rising powers to buck the status quo. Ever since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been the dominant political, military, economic, and cultural power, and that has allowed the U.S. to shape the world order in its own image. China's desire to ascend and supplant the U.S. as the leading superpower isn't just about ambition, though. It's because the U.S.-backed status quo is a threat to Chinese internal security. Under U.S. leadership, the world has shifted away from autocracy and embraced growing liberal democratic values. This is unacceptable to the autocratic Chinese Communist Party, who remain in power through a mix of coercion, intimidation, and vast amounts of suppression of their own people. As the world grows ever more interconnected and Chinese citizens are increasingly exposed to Western liberal values, China faces growing internal pressure for its own democratic revolution and the liberalization of Chinese society. This means the end of the Chinese Communist Party. To date, the CCP has kept large-scale desire for reform at bay through extensive censorship and the imprisonment of activists and protesters. However, if the CCP is to survive, it's not enough to police its own borders. It must exert its influence across the entire globe. The only way for the Chinese Communist Party to survive into the future is to ease domestic pressure by reshaping the global landscape in its own autocratic image and suppress liberal values such as freedom of expression, voting rights, and the right to assembly. There's only one nation that can prevent this, and that's the United States, as it's the only military, economic, and political power that might be able to resist China. War between the two countries will likely come as a result of a confrontation in the South China Sea, a situation of grave importance to China. For decades, the U.S. Navy has undisputed control over the Pacific and beyond, and this left China extremely vulnerable as most of its trade comes via that ocean. To prevent the U.S. from starving the Chinese economy into submission, it set about building a set of illegal island fortresses across the South China Sea. While denounced by the International Court at The Hague, China now operates several air and missile bases in the South China Sea, which leave the area hotly contested in case of war, limiting the U.S. Navy's ability to operate. But this was only step one. In its second step to defeat the U.S. Navy, China set about building the world's largest missile forces, resulting in the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF for short. The entire military branch is dedicated to missile and rocket forces. The point of the PLARF is to create a massive zone across the Pacific that's too dangerous for the U.S. to operate in via deployment of long-range ballistic and cruise missiles, pushing the U.S. Navy back further from the Chinese coast and leaving it free to influence its neighbors and bend them to its will. Then China set about to try to influence regional neighbors and sway them away from the U.S. This plan, however, met with disaster, as China's advances were rebuffed all the way from Australia to Vietnam. In fact, China's attempt to bring South Pacific nations into its fold only ended up driving them ever closer to the U.S., and Vietnam is now in talks with the U.S. on the topic of military cooperation. Lastly, China's attempted to spread its influence abroad through its Belt and Road Initiative, an attempt to recreate a modern version of the legendary Silk Road. China has spent billions building infrastructure at home and abroad in an effort to economically connect the world with China. The aim is to make the world so dependent on Chinese trade that it would be too economically costly to oppose China. But China cynically used its Belt and Road Initiative to also lure in third and second world countries with promises of prosperity, granting them high-interest loans the nations wouldn't be able to pay back. As a penalty for defaulting on their loans, China instead took ownership of the very infrastructure it built, leaving the host nation with little direct economic benefit, but giving China great influence over host nations, as well as strategic holdings across the world. But none of this will be the trigger for World War III. Instead, that will come from China's ambitions to take Taiwan. Today, Taiwan is an independent nation and has been ever since the Chinese nationalists fled from the victorious communists after World War II and established their own government on the island. Since then, the country has become a flourishing democracy, and quite a prosperous one at that. Seen as a stain on the honor of China, the Chinese Communist Party has vowed that the island nation will be reunited with the mainland, and China has attempted to infiltrate Taiwanese government and society to that end. Despite this, polls still show that an overwhelming number of Taiwanese have no desire to rejoin the mainland under leadership of the CCP, and they've seen from China's treatment of Hong Kong that promises of one country, two systems are hollow and empty. This leaves China with only one option: military force. Today, China lacks the amphibious assault capabilities to invade Taiwan, but that is rapidly changing within the next 5 years. China should have enough ships and aircraft across the Taiwan Strait in significant numbers. While the island nation will present a formidable challenge to the Chinese military, the U.S.'s pledge to defend Taiwan will embroil America in repelling any attempt to seize the island by China. This will put the world's two most powerful nations on a collision course and a war that will be devastating for the South Pacific and the global economy. However much improved the Chinese military has become, it's still behind the United States in terms of capability. The recent atrocious performance of the Russian military in Ukraine casts even further doubts on the capabilities of the Chinese military. Like Russia, the Chinese military has had a problem holding regular, realistic training. And while better equipped than Russia, the Chinese military also has a significant problem with corruption. While this might make it more likely that the US will be the ultimate victor, it also increases the probability that a desperate China will turn to weapons of mass destruction, especially if the CCP thinks that defeat by America will spell the end of its rule over China. The United States will inevitably respond with its own weapons of mass destruction, and the world will be thrown into the most destructive encounter in human history. Now we're moving on to our second most likely way that World War III will start: Russia. The current invasion of Ukraine is a result of two things: Putin's ambition to re-establish the Soviet Union and crown himself as a new Stalin, and Russia's belief that the EU and NATO pose a direct national security threat. While on one hand, Russia has a history of suffering greatly at the hands of invaders, on the other, it's utterly preposterous to think that either NATO or the EU have or ever had any plans to invade Russia. Despite this, Putin has made Russia believe that they must engage in a zero-sum game versus the West, where there can only be one winner, and it must be Russia at any cost. While Putin feeds Russian citizens a steady diet of nationalism and paranoia about the West, for the most part, is largely concerned with the latest TikTok trend and who's really to blame for Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars. That only makes the fact that Putin is even now planning how to dismantle the NATO alliance and risk a global war sadder. For the last few years, top U.S. military leadership have warned of a fait accompli attack by Russia against NATO. Putin is not suicidal, however, and it's unlikely he would launch a full-scale invasion of any NATO country. However, it's feared that instead he'll launch a limited invasion of a Baltic state NATO member such as Lithuania, Estonia, or Latvia. These nations don't just border Russia and sit on a large flat plain, making them nearly indefensible, but provide very little in terms of manpower or capabilities to the alliance. Thus, Putin's strategy is simple: invade a Baltic state, but take only a small chunk of it, even just a single village or town, then put his forces on a defensive posture. This will force NATO to decide if it really wants to declare Article 5 over not just a minor incursion, but a minor incursion on a member nation that contributes little to the alliance. The scary part is that there are countries such as Turkey who are major NATO members, but may not be willing to pay the price to defend a NATO country that contributes so little over such an insignificant incursion on its territory. And that's exactly what Putin is betting on, because the moment the integrity of the NATO charter is broken, so too is confidence in the alliance as a whole. With confidence in the alliance shaken, Putin can intimidate other nations such as Finland, Ukraine, and Sweden to not consider joining, and eventually convince former Soviet republics that they're no longer protected by the alliance, and it would be better to rejoin the Russian sphere of influence, or else. But Putin has miscalculated the resolve of America's current president, with President Biden affirming that America would defend any NATO member. If you're wondering why Biden has been quoted so many times during the recent Ukraine invasion as saying that he would defend, quote, every inch of NATO territory, it's because he's making it clear that such a minor incursion will immediately trigger war with America. The Russian military has proven that it is far from a world-class power and is largely inept, but the Russian military is still huge in size, and as Stalin is famous for saying, quantity is a quality all its own. A war between NATO and Russia would be devastating for both sides, though Russia would inevitably find itself losing and forced to choose between defeat or the use of nuclear weapons. With Putin's increasing erratic behavior, a nuclear exchange grows more likely by the day, as the situation in Ukraine has made it clear that he is willing to pay any cost to avoid defeat. Our number one flashpoint for World War III is so probable it could happen while you're watching this video: Russia-Ukraine. Russia has the dubious distinction of being featured twice in our video about countries that could start World War III, and has the possibility of a global war being launched due to Russian actions so likely that the US military is already preparing to fight it. On February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin declared a special military operation to denazify Ukraine. Apparently, to denazify Ukraine, he had to destroy half of their cities. So his troops surged over the border and his air force launched an aerial bombardment across Ukraine. Over a month later, Russia is, as of the writing of this script, losing the war, taking horrendous losses and ceding territory it had occupied to Ukraine counterattacks. Ukraine has even launched attacks inside Russia itself, something no one predicted happening, as all assumed that the vastly superior Russian military would easily destroy Ukrainian resistance. However, as we've found out over the last month, the Russian military is nowhere near as formidable or capable as Russian propaganda has made it out to be over the last 20 years. That doesn't mean the risk of the Third World War isn't increasing by the day, though. As we've highlighted numerous times already in this video, the more desperate the situation becomes, the more dangerous a nation acts. With catastrophic losses estimated at a rate of 1,000 casualties a day, the Russian military cannot afford to continue operations in Ukraine for much longer. And yet, admitting defeat is also not an option for Vladimir Putin, especially such a humiliating defeat versus a nation of a fraction of its size and power. This is why Western intelligence has been warning of the possible use of weapons of mass destruction by Russia, and their claims are not unfounded. Russia has for a long time been claiming that Ukraine is operating bioweapons labs funded by the US inside its borders. This is a blatant lie, but just like Russia staged a series of false flag terrorist attacks against its own citizens to justify a second invasion of Chechnya, this is without a doubt an attempt to create the excuse needed for the Russian military to use weapons of mass destruction against Ukraine. Perhaps most troubling of all, though, is the recent discovery by Ukrainian forces of captured Russian POWs carrying gas masks and anti-nerve agent tablets, strong indications that Russia is seriously considering deploying WMDs against Ukrainian forces. President Biden has made it clear there would be serious repercussions if Putin were to use biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but what those consequences are is unknown. With growing support for military action against Russia, especially in light of the horrible atrocities committed by its military against Ukrainian civilians, it's extremely likely that if Russia deploys WMDs in Ukraine, it will lead to a declaration of war between itself and NATO. However, this isn't the only way Russia's invasion of Ukraine could prompt a Third World War. The West has provided vast amounts of military assistance to Ukraine since the start of the war, with the US alone providing billions in lethal and humanitarian aid. Ukrainian forces have been armed with deadly US Javelin and British in-law anti-tank missiles, as well as American Switchblade suicide drones, to name a few of the weapons delivered so far. This military aid has proven decisive in the conflict and claimed hundreds of Russian vehicles and troops both. The threat of this military aid is so significant to Russia that it's warned it's willing to take military action against any supply convoy discovered entering Ukraine. This has prompted NATO to respond to any attack against a NATO convoy will result in the invoking of Article 5 of the alliance, prompting an immediate declaration of war against Russia. The Russian military is fundamentally weak and ineffective. If it has had this much trouble facing off against Ukraine's smaller, less capable forces, it has a snowball's chance in hell of standing up against the professional militaries of the West. However, this will only encourage Putin to use weapons of mass destruction to counter the West's conventional power overmatch. And even without resorting to WMDs, the Russian military is still capable of making this a costly war for the West. It's likely that nations across Eastern Europe would face devastating missile and airstrikes, and NATO would be hard-pressed to hold the line until the arrival of the bulk of the US military, which will take weeks to fully transition from mainland to Europe.